and his home was bombed by Allied forces, and he was injured and wound up in a hospital with a hernia, needing hernia surgery repair. And he and his family were in flight from Berlin to the American sector, which they reached in 1944-45. So his earliest experiences that framed his life, they were quite formative, and they influenced the rest of his life, were connected with the war and with the suffering that it brought. His family immigrated to the United States in 1950, and there he spent a lot of time on Southern California beaches, lifeguarding, diving for abalone, surfing, and went on to UCLA, where he graduated with a degree in psychology in 1965, and then went on to UCLA School of Law and graduated from there in 1969. From 1985 to 2011, he was the executive director of the California Coastal Commission. So that's 26 years as executive director. In over 30 years, he spent working for the commission itself. And there's the cover of my book. And I wrote this book because not enough people, in my estimation, know enough about Peter Douglas's role in coastal conservation. And so this is the first book out on the subject. And I spent 4 years researching it and writing it at archives up and down the coast, and doing about 35 hour-long interviews. Let's look at that coast. That's the Big Sur coastline. Now, not all parts of California's coast look like that. This is the coast of part of Southern California, Huntington Beach, in the 1920s. And so you're looking at a forest of oil derricks. And that's one reason why people began to become more interested in the condition of California's coast, the marine life, and accessibility using the beach. You know, how safe would it be to use the beach under these kinds of circumstances? Then came 1969. One of the points that Douglas made in his writings that are scattered all over the place. There's no single archive where you can get to his writings. So I was all over the place at the state archives and letters that I acquired from members of his family. One of the points that he made was that without major events, sometimes catastrophes, positive social change does not happen. And here's an example of that, 1969. How many of you remember that? Put your hands up. Remember reading it out of the paper and seeing it on the news? Okay, so here's an oil-covered seal, and many of them died as a result of that blowout on an oil rig in the offshores of Santa Barbara, more than 3 miles out. Thousands of seabirds died, and you may remember that the CEO of Union Oil Company, it was their rig that blew out, Fred Hartley, said, people make such a big deal when a few birds die. He said, there were no human deaths, so why should we be so concerned about it? Well, that message really hit home, because my mother worked for Union Oil for 35 years, and she was the administrative assistant to a vice president of that company. And so she would come home and say, God, Hartley is just about the dumbest guy you can imagine. And I guess his staffers just threw up their hands when he made that statement, because it was in the papers across the country. So that gave a lot of impetus to a coastal conservation movement that had already been underway, going back to the early 1960s. The Sea Ranch development up in Northern California, which resulted, for a while at least, in denying public access to 10 miles of beach that had earlier been open to the public, got citizens, like those of us in this room right now, agitated, and then they got organized as well. And then there was a movement in San Francisco Bay Area. 3 women who were faculty wives of professors who taught at UC Berkeley, including at that time the chancellor of the university, Clark Kerr. They organized an effort to clean up San Francisco Bay. It was called Save the Bay, and they were pushing for a state agency that would provide for cleaning up our coastal waters. So a movement was underway, but the oil spill really gave it momentum, and so what was needed then after '69 was an idea about, well, what do we do? And this woman here, Ellen Stern Harris, she had a ready answer to that. She had a ready answer for lots of things. She, by the way, was the first woman appointed to the California Coastal Commission. And she said, as a member at that time of the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, that we should set up a state agency organized like various water agencies throughout the state of California. And so you have a statewide body that has responsibility for water control throughout the entire state, and then you have regional water quality control boards. And she said we could do the same thing and manage our coastal waters. And she's the person that Peter Douglas gave a lot of credit to for coming up with the idea. So Douglas didn't really start a movement, and he didn't even come up with the idea of a statewide coastal commission. But nobody did more than he to make sure that a people's law was passed. And there's a similarity between that coastal conservation effort and I think what we're doing in CCL, because what the result was a campaign statewide to get Proposition 20, going back to 1972, on the ballot in November of that year. And they were up against very stiff opposition from the oil companies and from big developers. They were outspent 100-1 in the campaign to get this proposition passed. They ended up with a slew of volunteers who went out and collected far more signatures than were required by law to put this measure on the ballot. And they were told that they were told by the professionals, pollsters, that they could never do this as volunteers, that they'd have to pay people to be signature gatherers. Well, they didn't have the money, the people who wanted this, and Douglas was among them. And at this time, Douglas was working for Alan Seriotti in West Los Angeles as an assemblyman. He was an assemblyman, and Douglas was an assistant of his, and he hired Douglas out of UCLA Law School to help craft a measure for coastal conservation. So Douglas ended up co-authoring Proposition 20 and then campaigning up and down the state to get it passed. By this point, it'd be the mid-'70s, the Proposition 20 did pass with 55.1% of the vote, so by a fairly large margin. And when the commission was set up right afterward in 1973, this gentleman here, Mel Lane, became the first chair of the California Coastal Commission. And I put his photograph in this presentation because Douglas said he was the best chair of the Coastal Commission in its entire history. So Douglas was saying this all the way through. Mel Lane came from a very prominent Republican family. He was a very prominent Republican. And you can see co-owner of Sunset Magazine, connected to Stanford University in many big ways. And he was first chair of the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. And it's just an example of the importance of bipartisan partnership to make good things happen for the environment. In my book, I focused on 12 critical controversial issues. In the short time that we have this afternoon, I can't go into half of those. So I just picked one that I thought would be illustrative of the kind of leadership that Douglas exhibited. You may think back to the title of this talk was "Be Bold," and this was Douglas in spades. In the early 1980s, the Jonathan Club in Los Angeles wanted to expand by more than 13,000 square feet its beachfront property in Santa Monica. They wanted to put paddle tennis courts and locker rooms and a bar and a lot of other things into this space. But to do that, they would have to get a permit from the city council in Santa Monica. They'd have to get a permit from a state agency and State Resources Board, I believe it was, and then they had to get a permit from the California Coastal Commission. Well, they got two of the permits, but they did not get a permit from the Coastal Commission. Douglas had to think, is there some way that we could stop this from happening, this intrusion onto public beach by this private club that denies membership to women and non-whites. And, Douglas just thought, this is not equitable. There's an element of racial justice involved here, and by God, we're going to find a way to work this through. Since he was a co-author of the Coastal Act, he figured out something. He thought, the 14th Amendment has an equal protection clause. So laws cannot be passed, nor permits granted, that would in any way not grant equal rights to everyone. So using the 14th Amendment, he, and through the I should just back up a second, he did not want to risk the reputation of the staff of the Coastal Commission by having them suggest that the permit would be conditioned upon a non-discriminatory membership basis. And the Jonathan Club basically just blew him off and said, "You got to be kidding. We're a private club. We can do what we damn well please." So Douglas spoke with one or two members of the Coastal Commission. There are 12 members. They're the ones who make the decisions. They read a staff report and they decide whether they want to go along with the staff report. And so the staff didn't even know what Douglas was doing really behind the scenes. So he went to two commissioners who then broached the idea of conditioning the membership so that it was open to everyone on a non-discriminatory basis in terms of race, religion, and so forth. The Jonathan Club took him to court and lost in the trial court, and they lost in the Court of Appeal, and then took their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court, thinking they were going to win there, said that we're not going to take this case. So that means that they went back to the decisions of the lower courts, and the Coastal Commission prevailed in this. It's quite a success story because the Attorney General for the state of California at the time didn't think that this would fly, this legal theory. But Douglas figured it would. He risked being defeated on this issue and won, which I think is amazing. Several years later, the Jonathan Club had invited the Coastal Commission to have a meeting at their facility in Santa Monica. And an Asian Jew was president of the club, and he stood up and he said, "If it hadn't been for the California Coastal Commission, I would not be even a member of this club today." So this gives you just some idea of how important bold thinking and courageous action are in making good things happen for the environment and in terms of just the way society functions. You take a look at this photograph here, just look at all the diversity you see. Why, you see Anglo women and Anglo men, but you don't see anything else other than that, because that was the situation before. So looking very briefly at Douglas's legacy, co-authored 2 foundational laws. By the way, Douglas was detested by some members of the Pacific Legal Foundation. It's a property rights law firm which is extremely powerful. Started in California, to the best of my knowledge, is now nationwide. And I interviewed several of their lawyers, and while they did not like Douglas, and they thought he was an extremist, they had the utmost respect for his abilities, because they had a whole fleet of attorneys, and Douglas would defeat them time and time again in the law court. And they just couldn't believe it. Here's this guy, co-authored Proposition 20 and then the 1976 Coastal Act. That differs from Prop 20 in that Prop 20 was a temporary measure, set up a statewide coastal commission with 6 regional commissions only for 4 years. And after that, the legislature had to pass a law making this arrangement permanent. So Douglas was there at the creation for both of these foundational measures. And then under his leadership, the California Coastal Commission was regarded by many as the most powerful land use agency in the United States. And there are law school professors who have made this very statement, and I quote them in my book. And I went and looked at the statistics for beach access. More than 60% increase in beach access during his executive directorship. And he's dealing with places like Malibu, for example. And he forced open some beaches at Malibu through the Coastal Commission. Balanced economic growth with world-renowned coastal protection. California has the largest coastal economy in the United States. Keep that in mind. So when Florida gets a special dispensation on drilling off of their coast, by the same logic, we are entitled to that same kind of a dispensation. And it should be more than just California and Florida. It should be the entire coast of the country for that matter. But, so we grew the economy. We grew like I said, the nation's largest coastal economy at the same time that we have tremendous coastal protection. In 2011, a delegation from the organization, the World Bank, came to San Francisco, met with Douglas, and they said, California has the most protected coast in the world. So we had both. You can balance both, conservation and economic growth. And he mentored a whole generation of outstanding coastal leaders, and I mentioned their names in my book. One is now the mayor of Imperial Beach. Another is the CEO of Surfrider Foundation. Another lawyer, Mark Massara, is a Sierra Club environmental attorney. They're just a couple of the people that Douglas mentored. And finally, in evaluating what Douglas and what his leadership meant for our coast, this can be, most of what I said can be quantified. The beach access can be quantified. The growth of the economy can be quantified. But what we cannot measure is probably his most important contribution. Think about what you don't see. The Disney Corporation wanted to put a large facility right there in Long Beach where the old pike was. And the Coastal Commission stopped that in its tracks. If it hadn't been for Douglas and the Coastal Commission, the Hearst Ranch would be much more commercialized than it is. And Highway 1 would have been 4 lanes. There would have been 27 holes of golf there. So it's the things that you cannot see that I think we want to pay particular attention to. Now, some takeaways for CCL. Be bold. This is a fee and dividend idea is a big idea. And so we think big, and we also have to get behind it in a very big way to carry it with the public. Building a public will is indispensable. You've heard this before. This CCL says this repeatedly. You see this on a lot of the literature that we receive. Citizen participation is a key. Citizen participation has been very big in coastal conservation. And if we are able to stop the drilling along the California coast, which I think we will be able to stop, it's going to be because of citizen participation. And I just know lots of my friends who, I live in Laguna Beach, and we're not going to let this happen. Citizen participation will be the key. Use the media relentlessly. This is what was done to get Proposition 20 and the Coastal Act passed. The newspapers in the state were supportive of both of these measures, especially the Los Angeles Times, which was a very big help. But the letters to the editor, the op-ed pieces are very important. A law is necessary but not sufficient. I just think of that Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. We got the law. We've been waiting for that law for a long time. A 15th Amendment had been passed much earlier than that, back in 1870, assuring the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And yet, look what blacks have had to do to hang on to what's left of their right to vote in some parts of this country, especially in the South. So laws can be passed, and the Coastal Act is an example of them. And I've seen, as a coastal activist, I've seen how the courts have from time to time chipped away at the power of the Coastal Act. They complain bitterly about this law that's way too strong. And my book goes into exactly how they've tried to weaken it from time to time. And then I think this fee and dividend law is going to pass myself. But I don't think it's going to be the panacea that maybe some people do, because enforcement's going to be the key. We're going to have to stay right on all the enforcement mechanisms that we have any control over to make sure that there's not cheating on it. I mean, the law is a powerful tool, and I don't think we can succeed without it personally, but its passage by itself will require our continued involvement. And I would say, lastly, that with 1972's passage of Proposition 20, this was the first time in American history, this is my field, to anyone's knowledge, and to the best of my knowledge, that we have the people, the voters, passing a law. This made history. I think in the same way that when a fee and dividend law is passed, it's not going to come from the members of Congress, and we heard that so far today. It's going to come from the people. It'll be the public will that'll make it happen, and that's where each one of us is critically important. So let's get busy and make sure this law gets passed. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
15 minutes left.
Oh, 15 minutes. That's the shortest I've ever been on that. Yes.
The vigilance is needed also for who is elected to this commission, right?
Yes.
And
They're not elected. They're not elected. They're appointed.
who's appointed?
Yeah.
And what is who is on the commission now, and how does that look?
It looks better than it looked 2 years ago. I don't know if you first of all, let's back up. Who appoints these members of the commission, the 12 voting members? The state governor has appointees, so he appoints 2. We have the Speaker Pro Tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the Assembly. They each have 2. Then local officials appoint the other 6 members. So none of these members are elected directly. Now, to get to the other part of your question, it was, I would describe as pretty much a coup that took place on the Coastal Commission. You know what I'm talking about, and that's the firing of Charles Lester, and that was orchestrated primarily by one person on the commission, and with some other very bad appointments, I'm sorry to say, by Governor Jerry Brown. Brown has done a lot of good things. I think on balance overall, I think he's been a good governor. I'm pretty much appalled with his appointments to the California Coastal Commission, and I don't know how to explain it. He blows hot and cold. The Coastal Act in 1976 would not have passed without Jerry Brown. He's the one who made it happen. He brought labor and developers together at the very last minute with no time to spare before the legislative session was going to end, and brought them together and worked out an agreement. So that's how we ended up with the 1976 Act. So some of the appointments can be really, really bad. Yes? I used to know that, and I don't want to say, I don't remember how long they were for. I want to say 4 years, but don't quote me on that.
They reappointed?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, the one who led the coup against Brown was a Democrat who was reappointed by Schwarzenegger. Yeah. And Schwarzenegger was not a great defender of the Coastal Commission either. So we've got powerful interests that we have to deal with on coastal regulation in California, and it's just a constant battle up and down. Other questions? Oh, other questions? Yes.
I'm interested in the analogizing of Coastal Commission successes with CCL and what those images might look like. I'm thinking, are we going to have our landing craft move into South Los Angeles so we can build a bipartisan political will
Yeah.
to begin to move social justice and the environment to some coordination? What other lessons might we take from the Jonathan Club situation? Because I address this to the audience as well.
Mm-hmm. Anybody care to respond to that? Any other lessons from the Jonathan Club experience? One lesson that I would draw is that we can win. We can win on this issue. We have won in the past. The times have changed. The high point for California, and I want to say, California, by the way, in my opinion, has been the leading state environmentally from the 20th century up to now. But in the 1970s, we were probably at our peak, right around 1972, 73. And when Duke Majan came into office in 1980, he did everything to gut the Coastal Commission. The budget, he cut way down. They lost a lot of staff members. In fact, he said there shouldn't be a Coastal Commission. He wanted to have it abolished. So the times have changed, but I'm thinking now with what we're seeing in terms of the severe extreme weather conditions, that's going to help us. Maybe one of the challenges that going back to your analogy question, with a coastal commission, most of us have had the experience of driving along California's coast. I've visited coastlines all over the world, and I've seen some lovely coastlines in many other parts of the world, but I haven't seen one that matches what we've got. It is just so beautiful. And that helped us get legislation to regulate development on the coast and to assure public access to the beaches. Now with climate change, you can't see it as readily. It's not like looking at almost a postcard picture of a lovely coast. This is it's a reality for sure, but it's a reality that's harder for us to take in with our senses, I think. Am I right or wrong at that? If we could see it more, the results of it, maybe we would be more inclined to move right now.
Are you talking about the offshore drilling
I'm saying I'm just talking about addressing climate change in general. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Peter Douglas said it was the spiritual soul of California, the coast. But if you live in the Central Valley, your interaction with that spiritual soul of California is less frequent. You're not seeing it as often. So it's going to have to be something else. I guess I go back to Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of my favorite writers, who said, "The world will be saved by beauty," or words to that effect. And there is a lot to that. The world will be saved by beauty, he said. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but this coast is just so magnificent. And the beauty has helped save it. But there are other parts of the country that don't have the same stunning beauty, at least in my estimation. And the people there they're not going to be maybe pulled by that. Maybe they're going to be pushed by the health consequences of burning carbon fuels. But I think we have to have a vision to pull us at the same time that we have circumstances and threats pushing us. And so that kind of makes our job harder because not everybody sees that California coast. Yes, back here.
I was just going to say that it seems like some of these problems.
Yeah, environmental justice is becoming increasingly important, and you look at the asthma problems of children living around the port of Los Angeles, the largest port in the United States, especially when you add the Long Beach complex to it, and the health conditions there are deteriorating, and so it becomes an environmental justice issue, and that was mentioned earlier today, and that's really something that we should tap into. Well, this might be a bit of a stretch in trying to make that connection, but I feel I can say that we're not going to see new drilling rigs off of Santa Barbara, off of Laguna Beach, probably not off of Newport Beach, but if we see new drilling rigs, I think they're more likely to happen off of the coasts of less affluent areas with larger minority populations. It's kind of a microcosm of some of the larger steps that we have to take. And you have a built-in constituency for coastal conservation among the surfers. And I'm a former surfer, so I mean, at the drop of a hat, we'll be there. You know, if we had a group like that within CCL, wouldn't that be? And Douglas he described himself as an eternal optimist. And if you buy my book, or let me know if you want to get a copy. I've got some flyers that'll give you a discount. University of California Press.
Pass them down.
Just I have some more.
And we have one more book.
But he had an attitude that was, it's really hard to describe, of detachment. You know, I think of Buddhistic detachment. That was Douglas. He was never shrill, always bold. When they described the values of CCL, I just thought, God, Douglas just seemed to epitomize every one of these. And he could sit down with people no matter where they were on the spectrum. I don't know. I can say that in the history, getting Prop 20 passed, there was an opportunity that no longer exists with public service announcements on television. There was a law. It was fair. It's in my book. I can't remember. The Fair Communications or something to that effect, where if one group could pay to put a political announcement on the airways, then equal time had to be given to the opposing view. And so lawyers who got behind a coastal conservation measure, got behind Prop 20, they used that. They said, you know, use that opening. And so we got free public service announcements. There were some Hollywood people that Jack Lemmon went on the air. I write about this in my book, campaigning for passage of Proposition 20. Even Charlton Heston, yes, publicly supported the passage of Proposition 20. Of course, we connect him with the National Rifle Association. So they were able to bring in some Hollywood folks like that. That helped with.
But not John Wayne.
No, that's not even his real name, and we know that. Yeah. By the way, did anybody here in this audience go to Cal State Los Angeles? Two? I graduated from this university in 1965. Not 1865, 1965. Yeah. And I hadn't been back since today. But wow, campus has changed. Okay, thank you.